Welcome back to the Star Spangled Beauty Quilt Along. We are on week 11, June 23rd. This week we're going to be putting our quilt together. We've got our assembly, binding, embellishments. I'll show you how I'm going to organize to assemble the quilt. These are all of my pieces and my borders. I've got my little embellishments up here, the little buttons that need to be added. In the instructions, it walks us through each section, how we can assemble our quilt. We'll do that together. Before I do that though, I'm actually going to skip to page 52. That's where they show attaching the star buttons and the little pearl gems. I'm going to do that first. I think it'll be a little easier for me just to work with embellishments on a small block rather than working on them with the entire quilt in my lap. I have my patchwork flag and the star buttons, and then we've got our stars and floral block and the little gems. To attach the stars, I'm actually going to hand stitch these on. I don't like to do a lot of hand sewing, but attaching buttons is pretty easy. I don't think they'll look as nice if I glue gunned the stars down. I have a 30 weight cotton white thread, and I'll refer to the picture. Here's the picture on page 52. I'm going to use this for placement, and since I'm going to attach mine before I sew it into the quilt, I'm going to be extra careful and make sure that I don't sew anything too close to the seam allowance. I'll go ahead and do that and show you what that looks like when it's done. I sewed on all the buttons. Might have been able to do a little bit better with the spacing on those, but they're on. There are 15 in the kit. In the picture they only sewed on 13. I went ahead and put them all on because I had a big gap and I kind of wish I had one more button to put right there, but I'm going with it just like that. For the little gems on the stars and florals block, I have a Fabric Fusion pen. This is Eileen's brand, Fabric Fusion Permanent Fabric Adhesive. I'm going to use this to attach these little gems. This will be much easier than trying to do this with a hot glue gun. You can see they're in the center of the flowers. The small ones go on the smaller flowers and the larger ones go on the larger flowers. The Fabric Fusion, this is clear. It's just a clear adhesive. I'll go ahead and do one of these on camera. Right here is where one of the bigger ones is going to go. I'm going to put a little bit of the glue right in the center, and then I'll take one of the larger gems and place that. It's a clear glue, it's going to dry clear, so if it squishes out, it's okay. For the smaller ones, if they're too hard to hold, you can grab a toothpick. Let me grab one and show you how to do that. These are very small. You can kind of see that. They're round on one side and flat on the other. I'm going to lay it round side down. I just have a piece of batting on this board. There we go. So it's round side down, flat side up. It's probably hard to see. It probably blends in. I've got a toothpick here. I'm going to put a little bit of glue right on the toothpick. So there's a little round bead of glue on there. And with that little bit of glue, I'm going to use that to pick up the gem. Like that. And then I'll place that onto the flower. Just put my hand on the gem and pull the toothpick out. And that's set and ready to dry. That's the easiest way for me to work with tiny things. I'll go ahead and place the rest of these. I have all the little gems attached. I'm going to set this aside so it can set. They do give you extra. That way if anything falls off, you can re-glue a new one on. If you didn't buy the embellishment kit, you could go to the hobby store or craft store and find some tiny little pearls, little tiny buttons. You could use yarn and do a French knot. There's a number of things you could do. Fill in the center of those flowers. It does tell you to let it dry 2 to 4 hours. So if you want to use this type of product, make sure you have enough time for everything to dry if you want to do this before you assemble your quilt. In your instructions, I'm on page 44 and 45. You can see it shows us sections. We have a section 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to start with those sections. What I'm going to do is grab some design boards. It's a big board that's covered with batting and has a nice border around it, but you can make them yourself. They don't have to be fancy. Grab some cardboard, paper plates, whatever works for you. And I'm going to lay out all of the blocks in all of the different sections before I sit down and sew. This is a design board. These are 18 inches. I put a pin in the corner. I have some pins and I wrote numbers on them with a Sharpie. So that's number 1. And since we just did this block, it's number 1, and I had the flag block out. That goes in section 2. So I'm putting that on 2. I'm going to go through each bag and figure out which board they go on. If you're doing it this way, it's easier if you spread them out on the floor, or if you have a big table, or spread them around your sewing room, and then you can kind of toss each block on each board, and then you can arrange them in order as it shows in the instructions. Here's how I ended up sorting my blocks. I've got a chair, I've got a sewing machine table, and I've got another chair. Now that I have them all sorted by number, I'm going to start by putting together those blocks that have 2 parts, like the patriotic home and the vase flowers. All of my bags I can reuse. I can put a piece of tape and reuse them for another project, or put them back out in the kitchen. We can use them. They're just freezer bags. Here are my 2-pieced blocks. The house block I've done 3 times. If I seam rip it anymore, this fabric is going to come out. I can't get it perfectly centered. This one looks really good from far away. Just don't get too close. I'm off by about a thread. It's a little bit off, very, very tiny. These 2 are done. Now we're going to work on each individual section. Here's section 1 laid out. I'm going to sew these 2 together, these 2 together, these 2 together, and then sew the entire thing together. I think I will be pressing open just because there's a lot of bulk on these seams. I'm sewing everything with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. These went together pretty good. Now if you've been watching the quilt along from the beginning, you'll remember that I cut this one crooked. Do you see that? I put a little pin here and a little pin here. This is going to go together like this. So this part I don't have to worry about. But when I attach this to the hearts, I need to remember to run this straight here and then keep going straight. Don't let the machine curve or this block is going to attach crooked. Same thing here. I have these sewn together. I did end up pressing open. If you use the embellishment kit, these are made with denim. This is really thick. It's too thick a seam to push to one side. So go ahead and press open. And I set them under my clapper. If you don't know what a clapper is, it's a piece of wood. You do your ironing and you set this on the seam. It helps by pressing it flat, and it absorbs the heat coming off the fabric and makes it lay extra flat. You can actually pile a few on top of each other if you have more than one. Here's what you do if you have one that's cut crooked. There's my marker. I'm going to lay that down like this. You can see how short that is. So I want to make sure I start up here, but I keep this block straight, that I don't accidentally do this and pull it and make the seam off square. What you can do is clip it or pin it, clip, 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 and even add a clip or a pin at the bottom just to make sure you don't accidentally slip that block. It's less than 1/4 inch. It'll fit in the seam, no worries. Here it is stitched. When you open it, you'd never know. I'm going to press these seams open. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm sewing this on my Juki, the straight stitch machine. Section 1 is all sewn together. Here's a peek at the back. Everything is pressed open. I had it under my clappers and let it sit for a little bit. Let's move on to section 2. I have section 2 laid out. This is on page 46, laid out just like the picture. A couple things to think about. I did press the seam on my house block. I had to press it in one direction. It wouldn't press open because the back of this decorative embroidery is so heavy. The fabric wanted to go that way. I pressed it from the back and it was still sticking up, so I had to press it from the front. There's vinyl right here. Don't get your iron on your vinyl, you'll melt your vinyl. So be really careful if you have to press that seam. We have one of our frame blocks here. If you have to press this, be careful because there's vinyl here. That's one of our chickens. I showed that when I made the block. And then when you go to sew the block that connects to it, be careful not to accidentally get your ribbon caught. So pull your ribbon out of the way. You might need to pin it or clip it, and then stitch that together. I'm going to sew these 2 together, these 2 together, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 together, and then just like before, this to this, and then that to that. When you're ready to sew your ribbon block onto your flag block, You probably have to trim a little bit. I've got some excess ribbon that's past the edge of my block. It is all tacked down. We did that basting stitch to hold all that ribbon down so the ribbon won't come off. But I do need to get rid of this little bit extra that extends beyond the edge of the fabric border of my block. That's what it looks like all cleaned up. Now it's ready to attach to the patchwork flag. Here's my ribbon block and my flag block. One thing I noticed about this, the bottom of this flag block doesn't have quilting. All the quilting is right here in the middle, so it bunches up the middle just a bit. So when I was attaching these two, as the machine was sewing, I was using my screwdriver, if you have a stiletto, a purple thing, whatever, and kind of pushing this top layer, because I'm not using a walking foot, I'm just using my regular 1/4 inch foot. So I was gently pushing the top layer to make sure that the slippery stabilizer and the fact that this part isn't quilted wasn't causing the flag to be extending past the ribbon block. Just doing a little bit of manipulation as it's going under the presser foot helps feed that evenly. You can use a walking foot. I do have a walking foot for the Juki. I think it's a pain to attach, so I'm not using it. I'm just using the screwdriver, and it works just fine. It looks great. Here's these 4 blocks. I pinned my ribbon out of the way, no issues. I'm going to press open the seams and attach all 3 together and come back and show you what that looks like. This is section 2. I'm going to spend some time going over some issues with this one. Here are some of the problems that I had. With the ribbon block, it did get bunched up here. It was longer than these two, but I wasn't worried about it because I knew ribbons are hanging over it and covering it. You don't see it. So I went ahead and eased it into the seam and I didn't worry about it. Uh-oh. It looks like I lost a button. I'll have to go find the button. I was being very careful. This one was really close to the seam, so I had to raise my presser foot. Here it is. Looks like I have to reattach one button. That's not a big deal. I'll put that one right there. I did lose some of my star in the seam allowance, but I talked about that when I made the flag, and I expected that. Make sure you pin your ribbons out of the way. And this looks a little bit crooked. I may have to pull a little bit from the seam, or I have to press it, because if I see how like that, it's nice and straight, but then I have kind of a bump here. So something isn't quite square. I'll have to get a good look at it and see what I want to do. Make sure you pin your ribbons out of the way, all your bows and ribbons, before you put this block together. Stitched my star back on, and then the problem with this block wasn't this seam, it was this seam. It was sewn in with this block pushed down a little bit. I do need to go back and re-press that seam, but now it's straightened the quilt. One more adjustment I made to this block was I went back and put a little bit of that fabric glue underneath each of the stars. That way I don't have to worry about them popping off. We are ready to go to the next section, section number 3. You want to sew your star blocks together, your little filler block to your frame block. Watch out for your ribbon. The America the Beautiful to the filler block, and if you haven't sewn the vase and the flower, sew them together. Once these are together, these are together, these are together, sew them all as one section. And then these will be sewn together as the other section, and you'll stitch everything together along that line. Here is section 3, all stitched together. Let's look at section 4. You want to put these two together, stitch your lace block and your filler block together, and then that will go on the bottom of that. Stitch your cherries in your filler block, and then attach that to the map block, the C to C block, I believe it was called. Then you'll have a section here and a section here. Sew those together. Here is section 4 all together. I have all my sections on their boards next to my sewing machine. We're on page 47. You want to join your section 1 and section 2, then your section 3 and section 4, and then you'll join the two big sections together. Be careful when you're joining the top half to the bottom half. Make sure all of your ribbon is tucked up and out of the way so that doesn't get caught. Here's my sections 1 and 2. I did have to be careful because I already put my star buttons on when I was sewing section 1 to section 2, and go a little bit slower over this to make sure I didn't catch my star buttons. Here's section 3 and 4. Now I'm going to join the top half and the bottom half. Here are all the pieces sewn together. I had to put it on the floor because I don't have enough counter space. We are going to work on the ties, the borders, the backing, and the binding next. I think I'm going to put a dab of glue here and here to keep this bow from doing that. I'd like this to remain straight. And same thing over here. I think I'm going to put a little touch of glue behind the bow. That way they don't move when the quilt is on display and being stored. We're on page 49 where it talks about making the ties. I did cut the fabric for the ties and I accidentally put the fusible on the back. But if you watched the last video, I was talking about a couple of other options. One is this ribbon and another is this denim colored rickrack. I decided I want to use the ribbon for the ties. If you are using the fabric to make your ties, what you would do is fold it in half like this. Press it and then fold your edges into the center and fold it over again like that so everything's nice and neat, and then you would top stitch along both edges. That way all the edges are finished and stitched down. We're going to attach our side borders. If you didn't quilt your borders, you want to do step number 1, but we've quilted our borders. So it tells us to measure the quilt lengthwise through the center. That's going to give us a good measurement of our quilt. And then we'll attach our left and right borders, making sure they match that measurement. You don't want to stitch a border on and then just stitch it on and trim off the extra, because one side might be longer than the other and it'll end up lopsided. If you want to be really diligent about your borders, you can measure the side, the center, and the side, and average all three, and then cut your side strips to match. I've measured my quilt. It's about 54 inches. We need to go back and trim our borders to 1.5 inches wide. When I picked up the border, we did these last week, I figured, well, this space between these two stitch lines is probably 1.5 inches. It's not. It's about 1.25 inches. Rather than trying to get this exactly centered and like 1/8 of an inch on each side, what I'm going to do is get a ruler and measure 1/4 inch outside of this stitch line and 1/4 inch outside of this stitch line. These were the fabric tack down lines. I know that'll get taken up in the seam allowance on both sides. Here's 1/4 inch over and 1/4 inch over. My border that way comes out to about 1 3/4 inches instead of 1.5 inches. It's not going to matter. If you measure 1/4 inch or less out on each side and you're sewing with 1/4 inch seam allowance, it'll get taken up in your seam allowance and your binding. If you want to get exact with it, you need to cut 1/8 of an inch outside of this line and 1/8 of an inch outside of that line. I just don't feel like that's necessary, so I'm going to trim it so I have 1/4 inch outside of each stitch line. I'm going to do that with both of my left and right borders. Here's how I'm going to trim my borders. If you have any of the Creative Grids rulers, a lot of them have 1/4 inch line, and the ruler is actually, you can kind of see it, it's a little bit opaque right here versus easy to see through. It's kind of hard to see. You've got dark thread on dark fabric. But I'm going to line a 1/4 inch line right on top of that thread line and go ahead and cut. And I'm going to go all the way up one side and then flip it and go all the way up the other side. I have both my right and left borders all trimmed. Now I need to cut them to the length of my quilt. Mine measured just under 54 inches. Not much came off, a few inches off either end, and I made sure that I got rid of the ends where it quilted off the fabric and the ends with a little bit of excess. These were the top ends. I'm going to go ahead and attach those to the sides of my quilt. Make sure to watch out for this bow. Either trim it or clip it out of the way. Don't get it caught in your border. I have both my borders attached. I'm going to take them to the ironing board and press with the seam going toward the border. I have my scallop border here. If you look at your scallop, here's the scallop, there's a center to this. Like right in the center, I've got one. Let me slide this down. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 going this way, and 1, 2, 3, 4 going this way. So this is my center. That's going to be what I want in the center of my quilt. Rather than measure, I'm going to fold it in half. You can certainly measure, but I'm going to take my quilt top, fold it in half, and let me go grab a pen. I want to make sure my scallop border is on properly. I've never done a scallop border. We'll see what happens. So we're folding in half. I've got a nice mark right there. This is the halfway point. For me, it's right on a line of quilting. That makes it easier to see. It's right on this line of quilting here. And I'm going to want to line up this right sides together with that. However, looking at the job I did trimming, see how some of that fusible is sticking out? I'm going to go ahead and clean up that edge so I have a clean edge to attach to my quilt. What I'm going to do is trim right on this placement line. That way I know both borders will be straight. You have that 1/4 inch seam allowance between this line and the stitching. I'll go back through the instructions, but I didn't see anything that talked about how to trim these. I think we need to trim it on this stitch line. I've got both my scallop borders trimmed right along that placement line. Now I know they're the same size and they're straight, and I can get them attached to the quilt correctly. Here's the border as I'm pinning it on. Remember, I just trimmed right on that line of stitches that was the fabric tack down line. This looks like 1/4 inch. I bet that's 1/4 inch. Yep. So when you're sewing it, you've got your line, your stitch line right here. That's 1/4 inch. So you definitely want to trim those on that fabric tack down line like I did just a minute ago. And then you'll attach them with your 1/4 inch, and you can watch as you're sewing and make sure you're stitching right on this line here. You'll have your 1/4 inch seam. Attach your top and bottom, press them out, and we'll go forward. Here's the top. You can see how I'm a little bit over on this side and this side. It's the same on the bottom. I'm going to take a ruler and line it up and cut that. I've got my top and my bottom borders attached. Everything is trimmed so it's even. Let's talk about the scallop borders and the template. When you look in the instructions, it shows you how to use the template on page 50. I printed this last week. However, when you go forward in the instructions, page 51, on step 3, under the finishing instructions, it says to trim the scallops on each end of the quilt following the scallop tracing from the template or the fabric tack down lines if block by block quilting was used. We did block by block quilting on this project. I will not need this template. If you didn't do the block by block, but you want the look of the scallop, print this off and then follow the instructions here on page 50. I have all the borders attached. I'm going to set this aside. I have not cut my backing yet. It was the one thing I left at the beginning because I wanted to get a final measurement of my quilt. If you haven't cut your backing, there is a diagram here on page 6 showing you the measurements. But you want to check these against the width of your finished quilt. And here's how I do my backing. My quilt's on the floor. Here's my backing fabric. It's not long enough, but it's wide enough. I can see that it's wide enough, but again, it's not long enough. See there at the edge? I'm just a little bit short. This is a nice big piece. I have the selvage edge running that way. What I'm going to do is measure the width of my quilt, and then I'll cut a piece that's as wide. I'll make sure to trim off the selvage because I'm not going to need that. I don't want to include that in my measurement. I'll trim off the selvage. I'll cut this the width of the quilt, and you can see you're going to have quite a big piece left. Then I'll just make a piece fit at the bottom. We're at the step where we're going to create a quilt sandwich. It says to use your back fabric, optional additional layers of batting, and the top. If your project is smaller than 22 inches square, there's no need to add extra batting when using the block by block quilting method. The extra batting at this point is up to you. To put everything together, we're going to use a stitch in the ditch method. I'll show you what that is in case that's new to you. Here's the quilt. Don't trim this yet. And then I have my backing. When you make your quilt sandwich, make sure the wrong sides are together. When I pick this up and feel this and feel how heavy this is, I do not want to add an additional layer of batting. I have my backing cut to fit my quilt. We're not doing any additional quilting. Usually I will cut the backing bigger all the way around, and then as you're quilting it pulls in, but this is already quilted. We're just attaching our backing. You'll want to line everything up and secure it. You can put pins throughout. You can use what's called 505 spray. It's an adhesive. You can clip the outside however you want to attach it. When I start my quilting, I'm going to probably work from the inside out. That's generally how I do my quilts. Stitching in the ditch means you're going to run your stitching right inside the seam line. So when you look at your quilt, you can stitch on the seam line around each block. Because everything's already quilted, we don't have to worry that we're leaving too much unquilted space for the batting because all of this is quilted. Here are the things I'm going to be using to help me put my quilt together. This is the 505 spray adhesive. I've used this before. You want to use this in a well ventilated area. Give it a light spray. It doesn't stick to the needle. It doesn't gum up the needle. I like to use these Superior Top Stitch needles. These are titanium coated, size 90, 14, a little bit bigger than a regular needle. This helps with going through all the layers of the quilt. I'll be quilting this on my Baby Lock Ballad. I actually have a stitch in the ditch foot. Let me show you what that looks like. It has a little guide right here. Let me pick that up. As you're sewing, you set this guide right in the ditch of your quilt, and that helps make sure that it moves along inside that seam and you're stitching in the seam. It sets just like that inside the seam. It makes it easier to see where the needle's going, and then you'll stitch right in the ditch. I'm going to take my quilt and my backing and my 505 spray. I'm going to set up a folding table and spray the back side of this. Make sure this lines up, get it all pressed together, and then I'll set this up on my machine and I'll show you how this works. This is the Baby Lock Ballad machine. When I normally do quilting on this machine, I use a stitch length of 3 and I'll use a heavier 30 weight thread, but since all we're doing is stitch in the ditch and I don't necessarily need to see the quilting, I've got 50 weight Aurifil up here. This is color 2000, a neutral color, and I'm going to go with a stitch length of 2.5. I don't feel like I need the stitch length of 2, which is very tiny. 2.5 should anchor everything together. I have my top stitch needles on my machine. I have that stitch in the ditch foot. You can see that right there. That's going to help me guide my fabric through as I'm doing my quilting. Let's pick a seam and stitch one together. I'm going to start from the middle and work my way out. I'm going to roll the part that I'm not working on and then rotate and move it to the part that I will be working on. I'm going to start with this seam right here. It's a nice long straight seam in the middle of the quilt, and I'm going to do all the interior seams first, and then the last thing I do will be the long seams along the edges of the quilt. That way, as I'm working on these, if anything shifts, I can make an adjustment. I want to line up this little guide with that seam, but I want to make sure my needle starts right here. I don't want to stitch onto the border. There, I can feel it. It's right where it needs to be. Lower my presser foot, and then I'm going to use this little button that's up here. It's off camera. It looks like a dot. It will anchor the stitch for me. And now I'm ready to go ahead and stitch. Even though this lines up in that seam, I'm going to stitch slow and keep an eye on it. I'm slowing down my machine. I have a speed control up here so that if my foot goes all the way to the ground on the presser foot, it doesn't go full speed. Now I can see as I'm going, see how this seam, it's very puffy because everything's quilted. Sometimes my needle does hit on this fabric and sometimes it hits on this fabric. I have a dark fabric and a light fabric. If you get up right in front of it, you'll see the seam, but no worries, it's going to look good. When you get it right, the seam disappears. But we're people, we're not perfect. Here you can see some of the stitching. It's not going to matter. Anything I see here won't matter. The ribbon block is going to cover it up. You can see a little bit here, and right here I can see a little bit. But most of the way I got it right in the ditch, and that's great. That's fine. I'm going to stitch around every block to anchor it down, and then once all of my blocks are anchored down, I'll do the border. I have all the stitch in the ditch done. There are some areas where I chose to be what I'll call ditch adjacent. Like right here, it's not exactly in the seam, it's more toward this block with the picture frame because there's a dark fabric here. So I didn't worry about getting it exactly in the seam. It blends into the lighter block. I went all the way around, did my stitch in the ditch, but I haven't done anything with the scallop. What I'm going to do is go back to my machine. I'm going to increase my stitch length a little bit longer to a 3 or a 4, sort of like a basting stitch. I'm going to stitch right on top of that stitching line to hold that down, because you know before we do the binding we're going to have to trim it. So I want to make sure it's tacked down, and then I'm also going to go all the way around the edges of my quilts. So I'll go all the way around the very edge and then around the scallop and all the way down and around the scallop, and I'll be able to show you that. That's going to help tack it down and make the binding process easier. Here's what I did. I used a stitch length of 3 and I traced it with the lighter color thread. Some parts better than others. There's a boo-boo right there. And then I went all the way around the quilt, as close to the edge as I could get, just to make sure everything is tacked down and ready to go. We're on page 51, finishing instructions, number 3. We're going to trim our scallops on each end of the quilt, and it tells you to follow the template marking or the fabric tack down line for the block by block quilting. I tacked mine down with that lighter color thread so I could see and trim that. I'm going to trim that by hand with scissors. I think that's probably the best way to do that. And then if you're going to attach your ties, read number 4. I decided to use ribbon for my ties. I wanted to make sure that it'll be easy to tie this up onto the ladder. I took this ruler, it's 12.5 inches long, and I cut 4 strips 12.5 inches long. Since these are ribbon, I'm going to take the fray check. I'm going to dab a little bit on each end of the ribbon to make sure it doesn't fray. You can see that stitch line here. That's the outline in the light color thread I used so I could see what I was doing. I've got my really sharp Karen K Buckley scissors. Trim very slowly, very carefully. Go around all your scallops and do that on the top and the bottom. Here's my top scallop. The step with the light colored thread, again, that was just for me to help me see it better. I had a hard time seeing that dark thread on the dark fabric. That really helped. I'm going to trim the bottom and then we'll attach our ties. We're all trimmed top and bottom. I need to attach my ties. I'm using the ribbon. The easiest way to do this, honestly, look at the picture. Here's the picture. It's the full scallop next to the edge. I'm going to take 2 for each side. And it does tell you to baste them in place. It's going to get caught by your binding. I'm going to pin these because we're going to put the binding on, and as soon as we put the binding on, it's going to catch this. You can certainly baste it, but I'm okay pinning this in place. And then I want to make sure I keep it out of the way. And I'm not pinning through the whole quilt when I'm doing this. I'm just tucking it so it's catching the back, so it doesn't flop and I don't accidentally catch it while I'm doing my binding. Let's talk about labeling our quilt. This comes from the Junk Journal line. There's the selvage, so you can see. It's probably a couple years old at this point. I believe it was called Playing Card Yardage, and it has all of these fun frames. You can handwrite on these. I use this Pentel gel roller. It's for fabric, so you can pick something that matches your quilt. Put my name, the name of the quilt, the date, and my location. Then I use Stitch Witchery and I attach it to the back of my quilt. I iron it down. I picked a red one. I'll put my information on there. I'll put the Stitch Witchery on the back and I'll attach it to the bottom corner of my quilt. This is the very bottom corner. Normally I center it like this, and then I catch it in the binding. That way 2 edges of it are stitched down, but the Stitch Witchery, it's permanent. It does not peel up. I've used this method before and I've washed quilts. It will not come off. I have to be careful though because this has a scallop. So I'll place this one like that, and go ahead and iron that down. And then that will be in place before we do our binding. So as we go around and do our binding, this part and a little bit right here will get caught in the seam of the binding. I have all my binding strips sewn together. I did not cut this on the bias. There'll be a video linked in the description box below if you want to cut so you have bias binding. I'm back at my machine. I put my 1/4 inch guide foot on. I have my binding here. I machine bind my quilts. I stitch to the back and then bring it around and stitch it down to the front. When I sew them on the back, I use a small stitch length. I've got a stitch length of 2, and then when I bring it around to the front, I'll use a stitch length of 3. I've never done scalloped binding before. It does say in the instructions it's an acquired skill and to practice. I'm going to wing it. And again, I did not cut on the bias. We'll start on the bottom corner on one of the straight sides. I'm going to leave myself some space to tuck in my binding when it comes around. I'm going to stitch straight down, and then we'll start working our way around the scallop. Here's how I do my corners. Press your foot up. I'm going to turn the quilt, needle up. I leave the thread there. I'm going to fold it up. You've got a nice angle right here. Normally this would be straight with the edge of the quilt, but we've got that scallop. So you've got a straight line here, and then the nice 45-degree angle right there. Fold it down like that. I'm going to stitch the corner, which it's going to go straight for just a little bit, then it's going to turn and will adjust. Again, I've never done this type of binding before. We'll see how it goes. Back underneath, don't cut that thread. We'll tuck it under when we come around. You could clip it. You just want to ease it in and follow the curve. I'm going to hold this. I've gone all the way around my quilt. I'm getting ready to join the binding. I'm going to trim it at an angle so it tucks in nice and clean, just like that. This end is a raw edge. See the little frays of fabric? I'm going to fold it so I have a nice clean edge. Just finger press it. You can press it on your ironing board if you want. I'm going to finger press it. Now I have a nice clean edge. Lay that down, open it, put this piece in. You tuck it in. It lies nice and flat because you did that little point to the fabric. Make sure your fold is under, and then go ahead and join your binding. My binding is attached on the back. If you flip it, you can see my stitching. Not bad, not bad, not bad. That looks kind of icky. Curve, that's probably not the best. I had some difficulty with it. We'll bring it around to the front and we'll see what happens. I'll have to be careful right here. I'm actually going to double check that. Make sure it's tacked down because it's so close to the edge. I don't want to pull it and bring it around and have it pop off. Here's the top. I did the top second. I think the top looks better. It's still kind of ugly. I did use the guide foot to try and make sure my seam allowance would be nice and easy, but I'm not sure if it was all that helpful. It got a little tricky and kind of made it jam up when I was getting into the V's on the scallops. I'm going to bring my binding around to the front. I changed the foot for this because the guide foot gets in the way. I use a regular foot with no guide, and I'll increase my stitch length to 3.0. I don't clip it. I used to bring it all around to the front and clip it, but then I found as I was stitching the clips were getting in the way and getting caught. I do keep scissors handy just for that reason, all these little frays. Most of the time you can tuck them in, but you want to prevent this and stitching down over it and then having stuff sticking out of your binding. So if they're long, trim them. Just keep the scissors handy and trim as you go. Here's my little mat. I had moved it to the side. This keeps me from scratching up my sewing machine. Again, normally I would start in the middle at the bottom, but since we have the scallop border, I'm going to start low. I'm going to bring it around. You can also iron this first. Sometimes that helps keep it in place. All I do is try to get it as close to this edge as possible. I'm going to drop the needle. I'll stitch down and then we'll start going around the corner and see what it looks like. Don't cut your corner thread. This was where I showed the fold with the binding. You need to tuck that in. You don't want to cut that because then it'll pop off. I'm coming up on the corner. We've got a round corner. Normally for the mitered corner, I pull it like that, and it appears that that's going to work. So I fold it like this. Hopefully you can see that. I'm just pushing it down, and then I bring the bottom up. Some people like to do it the other way and tuck the bottom up underneath and bring the top fabric over, whichever works easiest for you. I find I get a better result doing this because it gives me a chance to press it and then to fold it up. Now you're not going to fold it flat because you've got your curve, so we're going to fold it kind of cockeyed on the curve, and then I'm going to stitch, and I want to get the needle right about there before I rotate everything. It's going to take a little bit of fussing to make it look good. I might even do a double fold. There we go. Like that. That has a good look. Here we go. Just going to drop the needle like that. I'm being very fussy. I'm going to raise the presser foot, move it, and what I'm going to do is just pull and ease it like I did from the other side. I didn't cut this on the bias, but it's stretching just fine. I'm not having a problem with it. It might stretch more if it was on the bias. I'm probably going to have some tucks and pleats. I just don't worry about those things. I'm coming around to the very end. I'm going to join up right here. Let's do the final stitches together and then get a look at our quilt. I'm going to back tack it and then use the little tack down button. That's it, we're all done. Let's get a look at our quilt. Here's the bottom border and here's the top border. Upon close inspection, probably not the best scallop border there is. This is my first time doing a scallop border. There's the bottom, and here's the top. Not bad. Again, I didn't cut on the bias. I don't know if that would help. I do have several places where, I'm getting close, I've got a fold or a tuck in order to make it around the corner, so cutting on the bias might help with that, but when you're further back, you're not going to see it. This is a great print for the binding. If you have to make folds or tucks, they blend right in. I've got the ties tucked into the binding, and then my label in the bottom corner. This is a ladder quilt. We're going to put it on a ladder, but we're going to do a full display video next week. Here's the ladder. It's on the floor right now. My husband made this. I did not have a quilt ladder. He went to the hardware store, got unfinished wood. These are round pieces of wood, and he put these really nice brass screws into it, and then he stained it. I'm going to put the ladder quilt on the ladder. We'll get a look at it, but again, make sure to come back next week. I'm going to do a full display. We've got flowers, patriotic punch needles, and all sorts of fun stuff. Here's the first peek in the overcrowded sewing room of the Star Spangled Beauty Ladder Quilt. All done. Make sure you come back next week. I'm going to show you how to make a big display that centers around your beautiful ladder quilt that you worked so hard to make. Thank you for joining me. Next week, make sure you come back on June 30th. Take this week to catch up. If you're not done yet, you can still finish it by the 4th of July. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions about the Star Spangled Beauty Ladder Quilt, please leave them in the comments box below, and I can do a Q&A as part of next week's video if I have any questions. Make sure to come back on the 30th for the display ideas. Please like, subscribe, and share my channel. I would really appreciate it. I'll see you one more time for this quilt next week when we make our beautiful patriotic display. See you next time.